Hi, everyone. Hey, I'm really glad you're here. It's great to be with you also. Well, a British man got some really tough news. He was diagnosed with terminal cancer. He was told he had a year to live. And after he came to grips with that difficult news, he decided that his response would be to go out in style. He quit his job. He liquidated his retirement accounts. He took lavish vacations. He began eating at expensive restaurants. He blessed his family with financial gifts, and he explained to his loved ones, I can't take it with me, so my goal is to make the last check bounce. Well, people applauded him and told him they admired what he was doing, but the ovation ended when he returned to the doctor and learned that his condition was not fatal after all. And when his doctor said, you are not going to die, instead of being filled with joy, his first thought was, oh no, I'm not going to die. And by that point, his savings were depleted, and he was in jeopardy of having his home repossessed. Today, I want us to look at the number one reason for money stress, which this guy in Britain models. It's overspending. Now, as we explore this, I want to acknowledge that some people's financial stress is caused by personal tragedy and things that are outside of their control. Health problems, company closings, pandemics, those things can create negative financial consequences, even for people who have always spent their money wisely. The town in which I grew up had two factories when I was a kid. One was a large paper mill where my dad worked. The other was a small textile plant where the parents of some of my friends worked. And while the paper mill grew and expanded over time, the textile plant was downsized repeatedly, and it eventually closed. And every wave of downsizing created financial hardship for families who were dependent on income from that plant. Most of them lived within their means, but suddenly they had no means. So look, even if you spend wisely, circumstances outside your control can change and create havoc in your financial world. The economy can shift. Your health can be threatened. Your spouse can make decisions that impact you. So it's good to remember that not everyone who is suffering a financial storm has brought it on himself or herself. But let's be honest. A lot of the financial stress that people experience is a result of spending ourselves into difficult or impossible positions. Instead of spending 10% less than our income and enjoying the financial margin, we spend 10% more than our income, and we sentence ourselves to years of juggling financial obligations. And a lot of bad financial decisions result from following the lead, the example of other people, rather than looking to God for financial wisdom. The Bible has a lot to say about money, and it's not the first place that most of us go for financial wisdom, and yet it should be. Shortly after Facebook burst into our world, people began playing virtual games that included playing virtual games that involve virtual farms and virtual pets and virtual wars between rival gangs and mobs. And the creatures and the items in those games did not exist, of course, but those who became immersed in those fantasy worlds behaved as if they did. And to obtain virtual animals or tools or weapons, people would shell out real money. And those who reported on this were amazed that billions of real-life dollars were being spent on fictional pets and possessions, weapons that held no real value. Now, you can argue that there is entertainment value in those virtual assets, that it's the same as spending money on admission to a sporting event or a show or a theme park. But research reveals that many who use money to buy these virtual assets for games are often pressed to buy food and clothing and other essentials. One study found that many young adults put more money into coffee than into savings. Now, I've preached against a lot of things during my years of preaching and kept my job. We'll see if I can survive preaching against coffee. We're going to actually focus on saving money next week. But as much as I like my daily iced coffee, I don't want to risk the future or downgrade the future in order to have my coffee today. One researcher found that some people continue to spend recklessly even after being forced to move in with a family member due to financial difficulty, even after filing bankruptcy. And he said this kind of spending has all the signs of an addiction, and he nicknamed it the urge to splurge. 2 preschool boys listened to their Sunday school teacher tell the story of Pontius Pilate being pressured to crucify Jesus Christ. And one of the boys spoke up and said he should have put Jesus on his plane and gotten him out of there. And the other boy replied, there were no planes back then. And the first boy shot back, duh, why do you think they called him Pilate? Had a plane. Look, friends, some of the things that we're highlighting in the series on finances could be introduced with duh because they are common sense money principles. But we are so heavily influenced by culture. We're so heavily influenced by the example of our parents and our friends, our peers, that we sometimes blow right past these common sense principles. So one of the things we want to accomplish with this series is to remind each other that none of us is exempt from these truths. Whether we want to admit it or not, they all apply to us, and the sooner we realize that, the wiser we will be. I don't want anyone who's associated with this church to live in a fantasy world when it comes to money. Nor do I want us to follow the pattern of people who are wrecking their financial lives with foolish spending based on their refusal to accept their own financial realities. So for the next few minutes, I want us to review some biblical realities about money that I think will help us spend wisely and manage our money in a way that honors God. The first reality is a reminder of where we left off last week, and that is we don't actually own anything. I read about a study involving several hundred cities, and the one that was ranked first in income was ranked worst in charitable giving. Now, I'm sure cost of living is a factor for people who live in that city, but still, to be at the top of the list in dollars earned while being at the bottom of the list in dollars given to charity is pretty much inexcusable. Last week, I read a verse from Psalm 24 that reminded us that God claims ownership of everything that we tend to call ours. It actually belongs to God. But it's not just one verse. Throughout the Bible, we're reminded that we have to avoid the deception that what we have is due to ourselves and that all we have actually belongs to us and us alone. In Deuteronomy 8, God was about to give the Israelites the land that he had promised them when they had been in Egypt as slaves. But even as they took possession of this land, even though God wanted them to celebrate taking possession of it, he warned them, do not credit yourselves for it. Look at what he said. When you have become full and prosperous and have built fine homes to live in, and when your flocks and herds have become very large and your silver and gold have multiplied along with everything else, be careful. Do not become proud at that time and forget the Lord your God. Now, you know, our land, our nation, kind of has a similar history to what God is predicting there for Israel. He said, you're going to have more and more over time. We've seen that in our own land. Many of us have seen that in our own lives. Notice that God did not begrudge them for eating good food or living in nice homes. He didn't even begrudge them having silver and gold, but he warned them, do not forget the source of these things. Don't forget God. And Moses goes on to remind them that it was God who rescued them from Egypt. It was God who healed them from the bites and the stings of vipers and scorpions. It was God who gave them water from a rock so that they would not die of thirst in the desert. It was God who gave them manna each morning, quail each morning for meat. And in verse 17, he says, he did all this so you would never say to yourself, I have achieved this wealth with my own strength and energy. Remember the Lord your God. He is the one who gives you power to be successful. Some of us have said similar things to ourselves. We have congratulated ourselves for our intellect. We have congratulated ourselves for seizing the opportunities, seizing the day, without remembering who gave us the day and who gave us the opportunities. And Moses is saying, don't ever let yourself say that. You know, we love the storyline of hard work and resilience, followed by success. That's the stuff of the American dream. And no doubt, those qualities are factors for successful people. But there are many people around the world who work hard every day, who demonstrate resilience in the face of many setbacks, who overcome injustice and poverty, who never have more than they need to survive. And friend, you are not better than them. You do not work harder than them, and neither am I, and neither do I. We are simply more blessed with opportunities for material things than they are. And with those blessings comes the test of whether or not you and I can remember from whom it came. As Moses put it, he is the one who gives you the power to be successful. And if you and I sincerely start there, we will not be able to stop ourselves from being generous and responsive to God, and we will not be able to stop ourselves from assisting others. A second biblical reality about money is that work is a blessing. Now, I doubt any of us in this room have ever encountered it, but I have heard a rumor that some people complain about their jobs. Probably a false rumor. I was eating at an airport restaurant not long ago, and I happened to sit down at a table next to where the manager and an employee of the restaurant were having a meeting. And the entire conversation was an exchange of complaints. When one of them took a breath while complaining, the other would break in with a complaint from his or her perspective. The manager complained about the company for which he worked. The employee complained about her lazy coworkers. The manager complained about travelers who did not understand that the broken supply chain is the reason that the restaurant doesn't have some of the items that they want to order from the menu. The employee complained that the airport authority made their jobs much more complicated and difficult than they needed to be. And back and forth the complaints went. And you know what? I am sure that some of their complaints are valid. I mean, on the traveler side, the truth is that when something is not available at a restaurant, my first reaction is not always understanding. I ordered a hot dog recently, and the guy serving me said, "Oh, that is the one item we don't have. We literally have everything else." So I ordered another item, and he said, "Well, we're actually out of that too." So I ordered a third item, which they had, but when he gave it to me, he said, "We don't have the sauce that normally goes with this item, so I hope you like barbecue sauce." I had never had barbecue sauce with that item. Now, friend, it would mean a lot to some restaurant employees if instead of rolling our eyes, we looked at them and said, "I'll bet you get weary of having to tell people that things on the menu are not available. I'm sorry you have to do that so often." I mean, we could breathe life back into some restaurant staff if we did that. If you say that to a server the next time you learn something that you want is out of stock, the server might tip you in barbecue sauce. My point is that even frustrating work is a blessing. In fact, there is no other kind. I'm not sure what it is about us that we expect to have jobs that have no challenge and frustration. Why would they need us if there was no challenge or frustration? From the time Adam first saw weeds growing in the Garden of Eden, work has been frustrating. I was talking to a person who is disabled a few months ago, and he said, "You know what I would love to do?" And when I asked what that was, he said, "I would love to have to get up early and go to work. And I would love to be asked to solve a problem at work. I really miss being able to work. We forget that it's a blessing to be needed at work. It's a blessing to be tasked with solving problems at work. Friend, when is the last time you reflected on Colossians 3:23? It says, work willingly at whatever you do as though you were working for the Lord rather than for people. Do we remember that? Remember that the Lord will give you an inheritance as your reward and that the master you are serving is Christ. The question is, will our attitudes at work and will our effort at work, will it merit a reward from Jesus Christ for whom we are working? And look, if you haven't thought of it already, this reality is tied to the first reality that we discussed. Can you see that? Because if the Lord owns everything, for whom are we working? Whose company is it? Whose department is it? Who is your ultimate boss? And here's a question to consider. If Jesus showed up at your workplace one day and said, hey, today I'm going to follow you around. I'm going to watch you work. Would you have to change your style of working in a sudden and strange way? Would you have to shush people who are accustomed to walking up to you and making snide remarks about the boss or the company? Even if you don't work for a church or a parachurch ministry, the master you are serving at work is Christ. And he is the one that you're obligated to please. And you're going to have to determine whether this is good news or bad, but he's watching you all the time. So even when your work is hard, even when you have to redo something and feel like your time is being wasted, even when your workplace is not inspiring, it's kind of dingy, even when your supervisor is a twerp, I mean, let's face it, sometimes that happens. Even when you are underappreciated, underpaid, under pressure, Jesus is watching. Are you making him proud? Not only with how you're stewarding your paycheck when you receive it, but with how you're using your intellect, your responsibilities, your words, your influence, your effort at work. The third biblical reality that I want to highlight today is that debt is usually not your friend. Now, debt always presents itself as a friend when you want something. I mean, debt shows up looking fine and smiling big and asking, how can I help you? Debt puts your mind at ease, tells you everything will be fine. Debt tells you what you want to hear when you really want something. But debt will always downplay the arrangement that you're entering. And debt will not tell you, you've heard this one, right? That the pain of the payment will outlast the pleasure of the purchase. And look, some members of the debt family are nothing but con men and hustlers. And for those guys, the more desperate you are, the more desperate I am to find a way to have something, the more they like us. Because for them, we're not a client or a customer, we are the mark. Now, does that mean that all debt is foolish and wrong? No. But it does mean that all debt comes with a price, meaning less freedom. And it's crucial that we not underestimate it or forget that. Most of us would never be able to own a house without some debt. So debt can be part of a sound financial strategy. But even good debt comes with a loss of personal freedom. Even good debt comes with some risk. It might be an acceptable level of risk, but we should not think that there is no risk. Proverbs 22:7 warns, just as the rich rule the poor, so the borrower is servant to the lender. I mean, ask people with student loans who can't see the end of their time paying them. Ask them about this principle. A year ago, when cryptocurrency was all the rage, some people leveraged, meaning borrowed, to get into the crypto market. But now crypto is down, might come up again, might not. Those who borrowed in order to own crypto are feeling the heat. And that's what Solomon is talking about. Those who borrow are always vulnerable to some degree, are always serving someone else with their work. Did you realize that if you put a $10,000 purchase on a credit card or at a typical rate, and then you pay $175 a month, it will take 15 years for you to completely repay that debt. And you will ultimately pay just as much in interest as you paid for the initial purchase. So what is the alternative? Well, the alternative is waiting. If you've never seen the Saturday Night Live skit with Steve Martin called "Don't Buy Things You Can't Afford," you should search for it. You should watch it. I've used it before several years ago, so I'm not going to play it today. But it is a reminder of how this biblical reality just doesn't merge with today's mindset about money, and we have to relearn it and have to make sure that we continue to honor it. By the way, if you're learning this lesson later than you should be learning it, check out the resources that Chip mentioned earlier. We're offering those free of charge during this series. We can't resolve your debt instantly for you, but we can and we will help you find the path that moves toward freedom. A fourth biblical reality about money is that living by faith is not the same as living without a plan. Sometimes people who don't have a plan say, "I'm just trusting God." But what they're really doing is winging it. They're on the jazz. When I was in college, I had some support from my parents. And since I planned to enter ministry, I had some financial support from my home church. And between those two sources, a little less than half my college expenses were covered. So at the start of every semester, I would get a notepad and I would calculate how much money the semester would cost, how much assistance I was receiving from my parents, from my church, and how much I would need to earn to make up the difference. And during my first 2 years, when I did that calculation, the numbers never added up. I worked in the school cafeteria, but I could not earn enough money in the cafeteria to pay the balance of my college bill. So I did everything I could. I asked God for help, and I finished every semester with my bill paid in full. And to be honest, it was because someone was helping me. It might have been a friend from my home church. It may have been a college professor, may have been someone in my family. Whoever it was never told me. It might have been all of those people at some point. But I eventually concluded that whoever it was being prompted by God, and that God was honoring this plan I had, even though my plan didn't completely add up. Now, later in college, I worked for a church and I earned enough money to pay for college. But here's what I learned from those first 2 years. That even when my plan didn't add up, God blessed my plan. That's the biggest advantage of having a plan. Having a plan made me work harder. Having a plan made me spend more wisely. And having a plan made me pray more. And without a plan, I would not have known how much divine help I needed for my college bill. And the only satisfying explanation I have for how all of that came together is found in Proverbs 16:3. It says, "Commit your actions to the Lord, and your plans will succeed." And friend, I believe that means your financial actions, your financial moves, your transactions, your decisions. If you commit those to the Lord, if you make a plan, then God will help your plan to succeed. God does care about your finances. The problem many of us have is that we've been operating outside of God's wisdom and God's advice and God's principles, but we're still calling out to God for help. And God is trying to tell us, if you'll honor, if you'll learn, if you'll hear, if you'll implement my principles, then I will bless your plan. And notice what triggers these blessings. It's committing ourselves, it's committing our lives, and yes, it's committing our finances to God. Every good financial plan begins with giving to God. That's why the Bible uses that word we talked about last week, first fruits. That word is literal. God never instructed his people to buy what they needed, to buy something they wanted, and then to see if they had something left over for God. He said, "Give to me first, take care of your needs, and then you can determine what you have left to do what you want." God taught his people to do that, and he would bless the rest. And he promised to make it enough. I read about a man who grew up in the Depression, and if you haven't read about the Depression, you probably should just go online and do some research about how difficult life was for people during the Depression. This man, when he was a child, he was given 3 pennies a week, which sounds like a ridiculously small amount of money. Can you imagine bothering to make a plan for 3 pennies a week? But he did. You cannot divide a penny. So he was not able to give 10% of his 3 pennies to God at church. So instead, he put a penny in the offering at church, which was, for him, obviously, 1/3 of his income. He was a radical. He also put a penny into his savings account, another radical move when you have so little. And he used a penny for himself. And he liked that plan so much that when he became a teenager and began earning a little more money, he just stuck with those percentages. And at times he wasn't sure that it would work for his next phase of life, but he would always try it, and God would always choose to bless it. Now look, I'm not saying it's necessary for anyone to give 1/3 or save 1/3 of their income. I'm simply saying that this man's story suggests to me that God really loves a plan that includes giving and saving and spending thoughtfully. I know a married couple who began their married lives with a financial plan that a lot of Christians use. It's called 10-10-80. They gave the first 10% to God, they saved the second 10%, and then they learned to live on the remaining 80%. But this couple decided that they wanted to up their game by adding 1% to their giving every year, and they did that for 30 years. And after 30 years, their kids looked at them and said, 40% is a lot to give. It's probably time for you to discontinue the plus 1% approach. And they said, well, actually, we've talked about that, and we want to make it to 50%, and then we'll freeze the percentage. So that's what they did. And they tell people they can't believe how much God blessed their plan. And while I've never implemented that approach, their story shows me, and it shows you, that God blesses a financial plan that prioritizes him. Friend, what if we have it wrong when we think, I would give more if I could just spend less? What if God wants us to think, I will give more so that I will spend less? When Paul wrote a letter to the people in Corinth, he was writing to people who were a lot like us. They were all over the place, all over the spectrum in terms of income. Some had a lot, some had a little. They lived in an expensive city where they were constantly being introduced to new ways to spend their money on themselves. But look at what Paul told them in 1 Corinthians 16:2. On the first day of each week, what's he referring to? He's talking about when they come together to worship. On the first day of each week, you should each put aside a portion of the money you have earned. You should each do that. Now, honestly, I suspect some of them did not do that. I suspect some of them felt that they didn't have enough income to do that. I suspect some of them had spent too much on other things and couldn't do that. I suspect some of them were new to the faith and they couldn't wrap their minds around that type of financial generosity. I suspect some of them were not big fans of Paul or didn't like a decision that Paul or the elders at the church in Corinth had made, and so they withheld their giving to convey their disapproval. I suspect some of them had a spouse that did not want to give that way. I suspect some of them had lost jobs and faced health emergencies and unexpected expenses, and maybe inflation was out of control for them too. I am not under the illusion that every person in the church in Corinth carved out a percentage of their income, and Paul was probably thinking about 10%. But here's the thing, God wanted them to do it. And God wanted them to look for a way to do it rather than looking for a way or a reason to avoid it. And I am pretty sure that God still wants us to think that way and still wants us to learn to do that. Not all of us will, but all of us should.